Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Taisis Dibra Maschel, Heicha de Iko Chifufei Chulu. Let's begin by looking at the flowchart of the Gemara, so we can see what Taisis is coming to explain. So here in the Gemara, we presented the answer of Rav Acha Berei de Raviko, who said that Rabbi Eliezer only said that Tzidi Rosh Hashanah, Ki Rosh Hashanah, that the size of the Rosh Hashanah are considered part of the Rosh Hashanah, have the status of the Rosh Hashanah, is Heicha de Leka Chifufei. If there are no barriers separating it from the Rosh Hashanah, then it's also considered Rosh Hashanah, since the public easily overflow into it. Aval Heicha the Ika Chifufei, but when there are barriers separating it from the Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi Eliezer did not say it's a Rosh Hashanah, and in that case, Rabbi Eliezer will hold that Tzidi Rosh Hashanah, Lavke Rosh Hashanah, it's not a Rosh Hashanah, rather it's a Carmelis. So this is what Tosfos is going to focus on. The answer of Rav Acha Berei de Raviko, who said that when there are Chifufei, there are barriers, then Tzidi Rosh Hashanah is not like Rosh Hashanah. So let's see the general outline of Tosfos. Rav Acha Berei de Raviko explained that Rabbi Eliezer only said that the Tzidi Rosh Hashanah are Rosh Hashanah when there aren't barriers. Then it's considered to be a Rosh Hashanah, but not if there are barriers. If there are barriers, then it's not a Rosh Hashanah, rather it's a Carmelis. And Tosfos is going to ask that it seems that Rabbi Eliezer holds, he's going to quote a Gemara, where it seems that Rabbi Eliezer holds that even when there are barriers, there's going to be barriers between the Tzid Rosh Hashanah and the Rosh Hashanah still over there. Rabbi Eliezer will hold that it is a Rosh Hashanah. So we're going to challenge the answer of Rav Acha Berei de Raviko, that Tzidi Rosh Hashanah will be a Carmelis according to Rabbi Eliezer. When there are barriers, we're going to show a Gemara that indicates that even when there are barriers, Rabbi Eliezer holds that it still is considered a Rosh Hashanah. So let's see Tosfos in the flowchart form. So Rav Acha Berei de Ravika said that Rabbi Eliezer agrees that if there are Chifufei, there are barriers separating the Tzidi Rosh Hashanah from the Rosh Hashanah, then the Tzidi Rosh Hashanah is a Carmelis. So it says Tosfos, it's a wonder. And now he's going to present the Gemara where the question is based on. So it's an arrow pointing to the question and pointing down to the conclusion of the question. It's a wonder. The Gemara in Eruvin asks, why is it that the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer argue in the case of a collapsed wall? The case where the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer argue is if there was a wall of a Rosh Hashanah. So let's say we have a home, and around the home there was a garden, and that garden had a wall around it. And part of that wall collapsed. So the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer argue, what's the din of that area of the collapsed wall? The Rabbanan say, Tzidi Rosh Hashanah, Lavke Rosh Hashanah. It's not a Rosh Hashanah since it's not part of the public area. It's not considered a Rosh Hashanah. Rabbi Eliezer says, Tzidi Rosh Hashanah, Ki Rosh Hashanah. It is a Rosh Hashanah since the public flow into that area. So the Gemara in Eruvin asks, why do they argue about this individual, unique case of a collapsed wall? Why don't they argue about the more typical case of a regular Tzidi Rosh Hashanah? They generally left space between their homes and the street, between the Rosh Hashanah and the Rosh Hashanah. That was a Tzidi Rosh Hashanah. Why don't they argue about that case? And then we would know about all other individual cases. And the Gemara answers that if they were to argue about a regular Tzidi Rosh Hashanah, then we would think that only if there are barriers, then they argue. Rabbi Eliezer says it's a Rosh Hashanah, and the Rabbanan say it's a Carmelis. But if there were no barriers, you would think that the Rabbanan won't argue anymore. Since there are no barriers, it's open to the Rosh Hashanah, the Rabbanan will agree that then it's part of the Rosh Hashanah. Kamash Malana comes to teach us that this is not so. Rather, and the way we learn the Gemara simply is, rather, don't make the mistake that they only argue when there are barriers. The truth is they argue when there are barriers, and even when there aren't barriers. So this seems to indicate pretty clearly that Rabbi Eliezer also argues when there are chifufei, when there are barriers. Because the Gemara said that if they were to argue about a regular Tzidi Rosh Hashanah, we would mistakenly say that they only argue when there are barriers. And that's a mistake, because they don't only argue when there are barriers, they also argue when there are no barriers. So we see that they always argue when there are no barriers and when there are barriers. In every case they argue, and Rabbi Eliezer will hold in both of those cases it's considered a Rosh Hashanah. So this contradicts Rav Acha Berei de Raviko, who said that when there are barriers, Rabbi Eliezer will agree that it's a Carmelis. It's not a Rosh Hashanah. So Tosfos gives two answers. The first answer is the way we understand the Gemara over there. And Tosfos says that this is the way we could learn the Gemara. Instead of saying we would make the mistake and think that they only argue when there are barriers, but they agree when there are no barriers, don't make that mistake. Rather, they argue in both cases. We could read the Gemara differently and say, don't make the mistake. We would mistakenly think, if they argued about a Tzidi Rosh Hashanah, we would make a mistake and think that they only argue when there are barriers. Now we know, Kamash Malon, not to say that. And it's untrue that they'd argue only when there are barriers. They actually only argue when there are no barriers. So just to explain the distinction between the two ways of looking at it, the regular way of looking at the Gemara is we would make a mistake and think that they only argue here. Kamash when it comes to teach us that they also argue here. Not only when there are barriers do they argue, but also when there are no barriers they argue. The way we're reading the Gemara now is it's not the typical way of reading it, is we would make a mistake and think that they only argue here. Kamash Malon. They don't only argue when we think that they only argue when there are barriers. Kamash Malon, that they don't. They only argue when there are no barriers. That's the first answer of Tosfos, that the two Gemaras are compatible and it could work with Rav Acha bar Ravika. And the second answer of Tosfos is that the Gemara over there in Eruvin follows Rav Papa. Rav Papa in our Gemara is the one that asked that we cannot find a case according to Rabbi Eliezer where a person's chayiv for carrying through a carmelis, because Rav Papa holds that Rabbi Eliezer will always say Siddur Rishus Rabim Rishus Rabim, regardless of whether there are no barriers or there are barriers. It's always going to be a Rishus Rabim. So Rav Papa said we won't find such a case. Rav Acha bar Rav Ika responded that I'm of the opinion that Rabbi Eliezer will say that if there are barriers, it's a carmelis. So we do have a case for Rabbi Eliezer where a person carries through a carmelis and is chayiv. So we all say that the Gemara in Eruvin does not agree with Rav Acha bar Ravika, it only agrees with Rav Papa. So to summarize, our Gemara we presented Rav Acha bar Ravika, who said that Rabbi Eliezer will agree that if there are barriers, that Siddur Rishus Rabim is a carmelis. We asked the question from the Gemara in Eruvin that seems to indicate that even then Rabbi Eliezer will say it's not a carmelis, rather it's a Rishus Rabim. And we gave two answers. The first answer was to explain how that Gemara could also be read in such a way that Rabbi Eliezer will agree that it's a carmelis. And the second answer is that Gemara actually does not agree with Rav Acha bar Ravika, it only fits with Rav Papa.